The year was 1944. Behind barbed wire and guard towers in the heart of America, thousands of German soldiers sat in disbelief. Men who had once fought under the swastika, who believed every Allied promise was just propaganda, were now staring at plates of steaming food that defied everything they'd been told. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, apple pie. They had been warned that America was starving, that Allied nations were collapsing under the weight of their own lies. Yet here they were, prisoners of war, eating better than many German civilians back home. At first, they refused to touch it. Trickery, they whispered. This is for the cameras. But when hunger finally broke their pride, and that first bite met their tongue, disbelief turned into silence. For many, that taste of warmth, of flavor, of humanity shattered years of Nazi indoctrination in an instant. This wasn't just a meal, it was the taste of defeat and the beginning of truth. By the final years of World War II, the tide had turned. German forces were surrendering in waves, their once unstoppable armies reduced to ragged columns of exhausted men. Across the Atlantic, the United States, untouched by war on its own soil, had become a logistical powerhouse. Ships carried food, weapons, and fuel to the front lines, and soon they carried something else back: German prisoners of war. Between 1943 and 1946, over 400,000 German POWs were shipped to the United States. They were scattered across more than 500 camps, from the rolling plains of Texas to the pine forests of Minnesota. For many of these soldiers, the journey felt like stepping onto another planet. They had been told America was collapsing, that its people were starving under the weight of capitalism and chaos. Propaganda posters back home had shown images of hollow-eyed Americans begging for bread, of factories in ruins, of an economy destroyed by greed. Nazi officers had painted the U.S. as a land of corruption and decay, unworthy of its own freedom. But when the prisoners disembarked, what they saw was shocking. Green farmland stretching to the horizon, well-dressed civilians walking the streets, towns that glowed at night, alive with electricity and abundance. Even the train cars that carried them inland had comfortable seats and warm meals. Inside the POW camps, the surprise deepened. They expected harsh punishment, cold barracks, starvation, perhaps even execution. Instead, they were given clean bunks, medical care, and regular meals prepared by American cooks. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, and the U.S., determined to show moral superiority, took that obligation seriously. Each day began with the clang of the mess bell. The smell of breakfast drifted through the air: eggs, bacon, oatmeal, coffee. At first, the Germans refused to believe it was real. "They're fattening us for propaganda," one soldier joked. "They want us to go home and tell lies." But the meals kept coming: lunches of sandwiches and soup, dinners of stew, vegetables, even desserts. To men who had survived on black bread and watery cabbage back home, it felt surreal. Meanwhile, in Germany, their families were enduring hunger and cold. Allied bombings had destroyed supply lines. Food was rationed to the bone. Letters that trickled through the censors often spoke of misery: mothers skipping meals for their children, fathers scavenging for firewood. The contrast was unbearable. Some prisoners of war began to feel guilt, eating well while their loved ones starved. Others felt confusion. How could everything they'd believed be so wrong? Camp officers noticed the shift. Guards reported that the German prisoners grew quieter, more thoughtful. They began to ask questions, not about escape or battle, but about life in America, about democracy, about how a nation could be both powerful and generous. The camp kitchens became unlikely classrooms. Over trays of food, world views began to crumble. What started as a simple meal was becoming something far more dangerous to Nazi ideology: proof that their enemy wasn't the monster they'd been told to hate. 1. Arrival at Camp Hearn, Texas, 1944. The train screeched to a halt under the blinding southern sun. Dust rose as the German prisoners stepped out, squinting, their uniforms faded and faces hollow from months of battle and capture. On the horizon, a line of guard towers loomed over neat rows of wooden barracks. This was Camp Hearn, one of the largest POW camps in America. The men whispered among themselves, "Is this America? It looks peaceful." Private Otto Müller, 23 years old, had fought on the Eastern Front before being captured in France. He'd seen death, starvation, and cruelty. As he was herded through the camp gates, his only thought was survival. The rumors among the troops said Americans were brutal, that POWs were shot, starved, or used for experiments. But here, the guards didn't shout. They just watched, calm and disciplined, their rifles resting casually by their sides. When the camp sergeant addressed them, his words were translated clearly. "You are prisoners of war. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work, you will eat, and you will be respected, as long as you respect our rules." Otto blinked in disbelief. Respect? For prisoners? That night, the men were given their first meal: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, corn, and gravy. The smell filled the mess hall like a memory of home. But most of the Germans hesitated. Some stared at the plates with suspicion. Others crossed their arms. "This is propaganda," whispered one. "They'll take photographs, send them to our families." Otto looked around. No cameras, just cooks moving efficiently behind the counter. An American guard, maybe 19, smiled awkwardly and said, "Eat up. Plenty more where that came from." For a long time, no one moved. Then, one man at the end of the table, a corporal from Hamburg, picked up his fork and took a cautious bite. Silence. Then another bite, and another. Within minutes, the hall echoed with the quiet clatter of utensils. No speeches, no toasts. Just the sound of disbelief turning into hunger. For Otto, that first taste, warm, savory, perfectly seasoned, felt almost criminal. He'd eaten worse while wearing the eagle on his chest. 2. The rumors break. Over the following weeks, the camp settled into routine. Prisoners worked in nearby farms or workshops. They were paid a few cents a day in canteen tokens, enough to buy cigarettes, coffee, or even Coca-Cola. Back in Germany, the propaganda ministry still told citizens that American cities were collapsing under bombings. But here, in the heart of Texas, the POWs were experiencing something else entirely: freedom with boundaries, not fear. Rumors began to circulate among the German soldiers. Some said it was a trick, that the Americans were only pretending to be humane until the war ended. Others whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, the Führer had lied. One day during lunch, Otto found himself sitting beside Ernst Weber, a schoolteacher turned lieutenant from Dresden. Ernst spoke softly, his tone thoughtful. "You know, Miller," he said, "when I was captured, I thought they'd execute me. But look at this. Real coffee, sugar, fresh bread. They even let me write home. Do you realize what this means?" Otto shrugged. "Maybe they want us to betray Germany." Ernst smiled faintly. "Or maybe they don't need to. Maybe they've already won. Not just on the battlefield, but here." He tapped his temple. "In the mind." Otto didn't answer. But that night, he couldn't sleep. The words kept echoing. 3. The power of the table food, as the camp commander once said, was the quiet weapon of peace. Every meal softened hostility just a little more. The cooks, some African-American, some Italian immigrants, served with quiet pride. They didn't see prisoners, they saw men. Occasionally, they even slipped an extra slice of pie or an extra ladle of soup to those who worked hard. In one corner of the mess hall, someone had painted a mural of a farm: golden fields, blue sky, a red barn. The prisoners added their own touches, a windmill here, a German shepherd there. Slowly, the space transformed into something human, no longer just a cage, but a reflection of coexistence. One afternoon, a Red Cross representative visited and praised the camp's humane conditions. The German prisoners watched as the Americans stood tall, unashamed. Otto realized something strange. The guards didn't fear inspection. In the Reich, such transparency would have been unthinkable. The next morning, Otto volunteered to work in the kitchen. At first, the American cook, Sergeant William Bill Harris, eyed him warily. "You know how to peel potatoes?" Bill asked. "Yes," Otto replied. "I've done it. In worse places." Bill chuckled. "Then you'll fit right in." As days turned into weeks, the two men spoke more. Not about politics, but about simple things. Family, farming, music. Bill told him about his mother's apple pie, the one she baked every Sunday. Otto shared how his grandmother used to bake Apfelstrudel back home in Bavaria. One day, Bill brought him a slice of pie, golden crust, cinnamon filling, steaming fresh. Otto took one bite and froze. "It tastes like home," he said quietly. Bill smiled. "Funny thing, huh? Home doesn't care which flag you fought for. Letters from a broken Reich months passed. The war in Europe drew to a close. The camp radio, forbidden to prisoners but audible from the guard towers, crackled with headlines. Allied breakthroughs, German retreats, cities reduced to rubble. When mail finally arrived from Germany, many prisoners sat trembling as they opened their envelopes. The letters told stories of hunger, cold, and despair. Otto's mother wrote that bread was rationed to one loaf a week. His younger brother had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, a boy army of last resort. That night, Otto looked at his dinner: stew, bread, butter, and felt a lump rise in his throat. He couldn't eat. Around him, others sat in silence too. The food that had once felt like a gift now felt like guilt. Later, in the barracks, Ernst whispered, "Don't waste it, Otto. Remember, this is proof that another world exists, one that feeds instead of starves, one that doesn't need hate to survive." Otto nodded slowly. "Then maybe, when I go home, I'll tell them." 5. The American Experiment. By 1945, American officers began an unusual initiative: re-education programs. POWs were shown newsreels of liberated concentration camps, lectures on democracy, and films about freedom of speech. But it wasn't the films or the lectures that changed them the most. It was still the meals. "Every time they treated us with dignity," Otto would later write, "a little piece of Hitler's lies crumbled." When Germany finally surrendered, the prisoners were allowed to listen to the radio announcement. There was no cheering, no anger, just quiet reflection. Some wept, others prayed. A few months later, repatriation began. As the first transports were organized, many POWs lined up for their final American meal. The cooks served roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and, as always, apple pie. Otto shook Bill's hand firmly. "I came here hating you," he said. "Now I leave owing you something greater than mercy: perspective." Bill just grinned. "You just make sure the next Germany builds kitchens, not camps." Otto smiled faintly. "Maybe both." 6. Return to the ruins. When Otto finally stepped onto German soil, the war was over. But the devastation was endless. Cities lay in ashes. The smell of smoke and loss hung heavy in the air. His mother barely recognized him. One night, sitting by the dim light of a candle, Otto told her everything: the camp, the food, the kindness. At first, she didn't believe him. "The Americans fed you? You were their enemy." Otto nodded. "That's what I thought too." His mother's eyes filled with tears. "And we were told they were monsters." He took her hand gently. "Maybe the monsters were the ones who told us that." 7. The Quiet Revolution. In the years that followed, thousands of returning POWs carried those same stories back home. Many of them would go on to become teachers, writers, and community leaders in post-war Germany. Historians later called it the silent democratization, a change not born from treaties or soldiers, but from meals shared in captivity. Otto Müller became a baker in Munich. Every morning, he opened his small shop with a sign above the door. Truth begins where hunger ends. He often served apple pie, using a recipe he said came from a man named Bill somewhere in Texas. Customers loved it, not knowing it carried the taste of peace, the taste of a lesson learned in captivity, thousands of miles away. Cinematic narration, emotional, reflective, and powerfully visual. The war was ending, but for the men behind the fences, another kind of battle was still raging, one inside the mind. The day began like any other. The Texas sun burned hot over Camp Hearn, and the prisoners lined up for lunch. But this time, something was different. The radio in the guardhouse crackled with the voice of an American newscaster. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. The words cut through the air like a blade. Inside the mess hall, spoons stopped mid-air. Conversations froze. Some men stared blankly at their plates. Others hung their heads, and a few, the diehards, clenched their fists and muttered curses under their breath. But no one spoke loudly, no one dared. Then came a voice, quiet, steady. It was Lieutenant Ernst Weber. He stood slowly from his bench, his eyes glistening. "It's over," he said softly. "All of it." No one replied. He continued louder now. "We fought for a dream, a poisoned one. They told us the Americans were monsters, that they'd burn our souls and enslave us. But look," he gestured to the trays of food before them. "They fed us. They healed us. They treated us better than our own leaders ever did." The hall fell silent again. Only the hum of the ceiling fan filled the air. Then, somewhere in the back, a fork clinked against a plate, a small, almost imperceptible sound. But it broke the spell. One by one, the men began to eat again, slowly at first, then faster. The silence turned into the quiet murmur of acceptance, a room of soldiers, realizing that their world had been built on lies. That evening, the Americans allowed the German prisoners to gather outside the barracks for a small ceremony. No flags, no speeches, just a campfire, burning low under the stars. Bill, the American cook, walked out from the kitchen carrying a tray. On it were slices of pie, fresh, golden, steaming. He looked at the crowd of prisoners and said simply, "For tonight, no guards, no prisoners, just men." The Germans hesitated, unsure. Then Otto stepped forward. He took one slice, broke it in half, and handed a piece back to Bill. "To peace," Otto said quietly. Bill nodded. "To peace." They ate together under the open Texas sky. The firelight flickered across their faces, once enemies, now bound by something more powerful than politics. Later that night, Otto sat outside his barrack, staring at the stars. The desert air was warm, the silence vast. He pulled out the last letter he'd received from home, his mother's trembling handwriting, full of worry and ration stamps. He whispered to himself, if only they could see this, they'd understand what truth tastes like. Ernst walked up beside him. "You'll tell them," he said. "When you go home, you'll tell them everything." Otto nodded. "They won't believe me." "They will," Ernst replied, "because when you speak of food, of kindness, you speak of something every human understands." For a moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of crickets beyond the fence. Then Otto asked, "Do you think forgiveness is possible?" Ernst smiled faintly. "Forgiveness begins the moment you realize your enemy fed you when your own nation starved you." Weeks passed. The repatriation lists were drawn up. The trains were being prepared to send thousands of prisoners back to the ruins of Germany. On the final morning, Otto stood once again in the mess hall, the place where his beliefs had begun to crumble. Bill was there too, wiping his hands on a towel. "Guess this is it," Bill said. Otto looked around. At the tables, the trays, the mural of the Texas landscape. "It feels strange," he said, "to leave the place that taught me what freedom smells like." Bill smiled gently. "You'll find it again. Maybe even bake it." Otto laughed softly. "Maybe." Bill reached into his apron pocket and handed Otto a small folded piece of paper. "It's my mother's recipe," he said. "Apple pie, for when you need to remember what peace tastes like." Otto held it carefully, as though it was something sacred. "Danke," he whispered. They shook hands. Firm, silent, unspoken. When Otto boarded the train, he looked back one last time. The camp fences shimmered in the morning light, not as prison walls anymore, but as lines that had separated hate from understanding. The whistle blew. The train lurched forward. As Texas faded behind him, Otto unfolded the recipe and smiled. It was written in simple English, but he understood every word. That night, under the glow of the train's lantern, Otto took out his notebook and wrote, "The war taught me how to fight. America taught me how to think. But it was their food that taught me how to feel." He closed the notebook, set it beside him, and looked out the window. The stars stretched endlessly across the black sky, vast, eternal, and free. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, humanity could rebuild, and that the taste of peace would be remembered forever. When the war ended, millions of soldiers returned home carrying scars, some visible, most not. But for those German prisoners who had spent their captivity in America, they brought back something rare, a memory of kindness in the middle of chaos. Otto Müller was one of them. He arrived in a Germany that barely resembled the land he'd left. Cities were rubble. The air smelled of ash and loss. Families were divided not just by walls of brick and stone, but by silence, guilt, and disbelief. At first, no one wanted to hear his stories. When Otto spoke of clean camps, fair treatment, and American food, his neighbors stared in confusion or anger. "Lies," some said. "You were brainwashed," but others listened quietly. Wives of missing soldiers, mothers who had buried their sons. They leaned closer, searching his eyes for the truth. One evening, at a church gathering, Otto stood up and told his story openly for the first time. He spoke not of victory or defeat, but of the moment he realized that mercy could be stronger than hate. He described the meals, the laughter, the American cook who gave him pie when he least deserved kindness. When he finished, the room was silent. Then an old man, a former soldier from the Eastern Front, began to cry. "We were told they were monsters," he whispered. "But maybe the monsters were the ones who told us to stop seeing men as human." That night, something began to shift. Across post-war Germany, thousands of former POWs returned with similar stories. They formed small reunions, gatherings that historians later called comradeship of understanding. These men had lived inside the enemy's land and discovered a truth that Nazi propaganda had buried, that compassion could survive even war. Many of them went on to teach, to build, to heal. In the 1950s, Germany began to rebuild its schools, its factories, its sense of moral identity. Hidden deep within that reconstruction was the quiet influence of those who had eaten American bread, who had seen that the world didn't have to be divided into master and slave, strong and weak, worthy and unworthy. Their letters, preserved in archives decades later, tell the same story in different words. They defeated us, not only with bombs and bullets, but with dignity. Otto opened his bakery in Munich in 1951. It was small, just a corner shop, tucked between a pharmacy and a tailor. But every morning, people lined up outside. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon filled the street, and on the counter sat a golden pie, always warm, always ready. Above the doorway hung a wooden sign carved with the words, Truth begins where hunger ends. When curious customers asked about it, Otto would smile gently and say, "It's something I learned in captivity." Then he'd tell them about a man named Bill, a cook from Texas who believed food could heal what hate had broken. Years later, when historians began documenting the experiences of German POWs in America, they were astonished by what they found. Interviews with men like Otto revealed a pattern that exposure to fairness, decency, and abundance had quietly reshaped how thousands viewed the world. A 1956 U.S. Army report summarized it simply: the meal line in the POW camps may have done more to denazify Germany than any classroom ever could. And in a way, it was true. The propaganda machine of the Third Reich had built its power on fear, the fear of starvation, of collapse, of enemies dehumanized. But in America's POW camps, those lies dissolved over steaming plates of stew and pie. It wasn't speeches that changed hearts. It was food, simple, consistent, human food that spoke louder than ideology. By the 1970s, when Otto was an old man, he received a letter from across the Atlantic. It was from Bill's daughter. She wrote that her father had passed away, but often spoke about a German boy who learned to bake pie like it meant something. She enclosed a photograph: Bill standing in front of a camp kitchen, flour on his hands, smiling. On the back, a short note, in fading ink: "For Otto, because peace is something you feed, not fight for." Otto placed the photo on his bakery wall, beside the recipe that had started it all. Every morning, before opening shop, he'd touch the frame lightly and whisper, "Danke, mein Freund." In the end, Otto's story, like those of thousands of others, became a quiet thread in the fabric of reconciliation between former enemies. Decades later, when American veterans visited Germany, they were often greeted not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Many were offered coffee, cakes, and yes, apple pie. And so, what began as propaganda, a myth meant to divide, ended with a meal that united. For the German POWs, the truth came not from speeches or surrender papers, but from a spoonful of kindness that shattered everything they thought they knew. Because sometimes history isn't written by generals or governments. Sometimes it's written at a dinner table, in the silence between bites, when a man realizes that the enemy feeding him might be the only one telling the truth. And in that moment, under a distant Texas sky, thousands of German prisoners learned a lesson no war could erase. Humanity can't be conquered, only rediscovered.